Hey everyone, it's time for our midweek devotional out of Acts chapter 14, the very last verses that we see in that chapter. This has been an incredible study in the book of Acts, particularly during this time when so much of us are just experiencing upheaval in our regular routines, and the church has been through ups and downs as well. And we're all in this together. And what's been comforting is to look at all the upheavals and the conflict that we see in the book of Acts. And we see that the early church, it had its struggles too. It had its trials, its tribulations. And all throughout everything it's going through, you see the Spirit of God that is present and giving strength and giving direction and giving wisdom. And that God is still moving, still going. There's been lots of conflict, right? There's been lots of conflict between the church and the temple and the Israel authorities, the religious authorities in Israel and Jerusalem. And now as we move through the book, we're going to see lots of conflict develop between the church and Roman authorities. We saw that Peter was one of the central characters early on in the book, and now that we get towards the center of the book, Paul comes more into focus. And his ministry, while we see him introduced, earlier in earlier chapters, he really takes center stage starting in Acts chapter 13. And already in the first two chapters, where he is that one of the central figures in Acts 13 and 14, there's just tons of conflict, not least of which is when he's dragged out of the city and persecuted, left for dead. He's beaten, gets back up and goes back into the city to continue his work. I mean, just incredible things that you could add up and add up and add up that he could complain about. He could see as negative parts of his ministry. And as he returns on his first journey out to starting churches and around the area that we know as Turkey and Greece and all that, around the Mediterranean, he comes back from that first journey with plenty of conflict, plenty of trials, plenty of tribulations. And here is what we read as he comes back to Antioch and gives his first report. The chapter ends this way. When they arrived, they called the church together and related all that God had done with them and how he had opened a door of faith for the Gentiles. And they stayed there with the disciples for some time. Now, what's so interesting about that to me is that I think that many of us, our minds go to the negative. We go to the conflict. We go to the hard times. We go to the trial. And particularly now during this pandemic, we can easily get focused on all the struggles that we have. And yet Paul comes back from this journey and he's talking about all these great things that are happening. He's talking about non-Jewish people, Gentiles, coming to faith. He's talking about what God is up to. He talks about, just gives a report on all these churches being planted. And yet we don't see there in that little notice that negativity. We don't see him talk about how he was beaten and left. And, he talks about this in other places. But it's just interesting to me that in this section, as he comes back, he's reporting on all that God has done in bringing people into the fold of faith. And even when he experienced some conflict in Lystra that we talked about last Sunday and earlier in Acts 14, they bring the message in, and his message to these people who worship Zeus and Hermes and all these other gods, his message is one that God has been with you the whole time and God has been providing for you. Turn away from these useless idols that will not bring any life to you. They cannot see, they cannot hear. He talks about God who has provided the rain, the sunshine, and he talks about the joy in our hearts, the joy that we feel. And I love that amidst all this conflict, amidst all this trial and tribulation and even in the next chapter coming up in chapter 15, which is so central to the book, there's a lot of internal conflict within the church. And in the midst of all this conflict, he focuses on these things in that sermon in Lystra and on his report home back to Antioch. He talks about all the good things. And so I want to challenge us today to think about all the good things that we're experiencing in our church, in our families, at work, and at home. Make a list. Take some time in prayer and start listing out. Actually, list it out, the things that you can be thankful for: food, shelter, beautiful days, time with friends or family, even at a distance, even social distancing. That time where we run into people that we know out and about. All these little things, the things that bring joy to our hearts. That's part of his sermon. I love that part, that we recognize God when we feel those feelings of joy. When was the last time you felt that? Have you felt it today, yesterday? Identify that and give God thanks for that. And when it's in a time where it's so easy to complain, to look at conflict, and certainly we can bring those conflicts to God, but let's take some time and be thankful and remember that God gives us all these good things. All right, we'll see you on Sunday. Take care.